All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing time so far. Our next panel is titled AI for Patient Engagement and Clinical Trials. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the virtual stage. And I'll hand it over to Peter, our moderator.
Hello, welcome. We have an exciting session for you here. My name is Peter Henstock, and I am the machine learning and AI lead at Pfizer. I've been there for a number of years working with the digital group, but more recently in the clinical space with our statistics group. And I think we have an introductory slide for different people. Is that right? If not, we'll just go straight and I'll ask Archna to present or introduce herself rather.
Thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Archna Bhandari, and I am Executive Vice President of Data and Analytics at Expert.ai. My role involves bringing data and domain expertise and combine it with artificial intelligence technologies to build solutions for life sciences and pharma industry. Prior to joining Expert.ai, I worked at National Institutes of Health, and where we mined the research articles and extract information to turn into dollar amount for funding and reporting to Congress. So it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Dimitar.
Yes, so thank you, Peter. This is Dimitar Jetchev. I am the CTO and co-founder of a US Swiss-based company, Inpher, for privacy-preserving machine learning and data analytics with numerous applications in healthcare. I'm also on the faculty of EPFL, Swiss Polytechnic Federal Institute, where the company started 5 years ago. And I'm very excited to talk about different applications of artificial intelligence in various aspects of healthcare today.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. And last we have Philippe.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everybody. My name is Philippe Moingeon. I'm the head of Immunoinflammation at Servier Pharmaceuticals, headquartered in France. I am an immunologist, and I will act on the panel as an end user of artificial intelligence. I'm trying basically to develop new immunotherapies for patients with autoimmune diseases with a keen interest for using AI in drug development, and including actually in support of clinical studies.
Thank you. So as you can see, we have a panel of experts and diversity as well. So I'd like to go to our first question. It's been a tough 12 months. It feels much longer. Has AI played a supportive role during COVID or not? Who would like to tackle this question?
I can, if you like.
Wonderful, please.
Sure. So 2020 was indeed a tough year. What we saw in 2020 was a surge in life sciences data content in terms of number of publications. There were a lot of preprint articles, number of clinical trials had increased. So the biggest challenge was for research and clinicians was to digest this information and drive insights in a quick, timely fashion. So AI played a big role in terms of mining this data, which was unstructured to semi-structured, and extracting key information for discovery and analysis purpose. And as you know, like language is easy for human beings to understand, but for computer, it is not that easy. Just as an example, like when an article mentions about cat, it could be related to cat as a gene or cat as a computed tomography. So as human beings, we can easily distinguish these two concepts, but for computers, it is difficult. And that's where AI, based on the contextual information, can help us. So as a technology company, we made our AI platform where we bring all the data in terms of publications, patents, clinical trials, available to all researchers and clinicians around the world free of charge. And that's where they could get the information quickly for their own information, discovery and analysis purposes. And we also did partnership with the New England Journal of Medicine and created a COVID-19 dashboard so that we can look at not just entities, but relationship in terms of symptoms, diseases, risk factors, etc. Again, to help with the discovery and analysis process to find the treatments for COVID-19.
Wonderful. Does anyone else like to add to that?
Well, I can I can add to that. So my background is not medical, although I'm more on the computer security informatics as well as statistics side. But I have strong interest on the side of bioinformatics and anything that's healthcare related. So the company, Inpher, is providing a platform that could be used to solve a lot of privacy challenges of putting together different data sources from that cannot otherwise be combined into one location for proper data analytics. So the past year has been extremely dynamic in terms of healthcare applications. And here I could talk about maybe 4 kind of different directions in healthcare where we're seeing a significant increase in AI applications. So first of all, we can talk about digital diagnostics. Everybody's discussing problems around X-ray image, automatic recognition with neural networks, etc. So the second direction that we obviously are all here at this panel is clinical trials. We have seen a lot of interesting development also in actual drug development, which we can get more into, but one of the directions that's actually shown very promising as well is bioinformatics and cheminformatics. So this past year, one thing that we saw was, for example, one of the big open problems, the protein folding problems in the AlphaFold technology of Google that helped solve this 50-year problem using AI. We have seen the discovery of new antibiotics, Halicin, and using really advanced artificial intelligence neural network technologies. So as a company, we are committed to make sure that these analytics can be done in a kind of distributed, privacy-preserving fashion.
That's great to hear. I'll go with your immunology expertise, Philippe, but did COVID enter your world at all?
Well, certainly, obviously, we have been impacted, like I would say, all pharmaceutical companies by this pandemics, and this has really impacted us in the monitoring of our ongoing clinical studies, for sure. And we had to perform some remote monitoring, as you can imagine, with many patients very reluctant to going to their local hospitals. And thus, for us, it has been really an experience with, I would say, digital technologies to try to retrieve data through patients, for example, by exchanging questionnaires, or from even hospitals, trying to retrieve source data for validation for our own monitoring. So, but I would say we have not really been using AI per se for this. It was really, I would say, getting more acquainted with digital technologies. But I would predict that actually this experience, largely shared across the whole pharmaceutical industry, will facilitate the introduction of AI in support of clinical studies in the form of execution of clinical studies via telemedicine, for example. Also, I would say comprehensive digitalization of data sharing, implementing of data analytics to develop algorithms for supporting decision making in the context of clinical studies. So I would say certainly, this experience we had in the last year will change the field and really push many players to encompass or to integrate, I would say, artificial intelligence as it applies to clinical evaluation of patients.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Philippe, about the last point about where COVID has pushed us. It disrupted all our clinical trials, of course, and forced us to do different things. But for the large part, I would say that COVID was not a great win story for AI. And I thought we had lots of competitions and Kaggle that were going on to try to predict the outcome. There were studies of predicting the diagnostics from imaging and all sorts of techniques and assisting everything, predicting progression of the disease, hospitalization, everything else. But a lot of these things just didn't seem to work as well as I had hoped they would. And part of it was because of the data collection really wasn't there. It took us months before we really figured out the daily readouts from different states. They all went into some kind of a tailspin, I think. And there was this BMJ review recently that looked at about 30,000 studies and all these different kinds of titles and prediction models and everything else. And they said, all these studies have a huge risk of bias. They're small numbers. They're not going to generalize very well. And so I was kind of disappointed that AI hadn't done better than it actually had. Does anyone else feel that way about the COVID journey?
Right,
Yeah,
I agree.
go ahead. Sorry, again.
No, like with COVID, we were also learning, right? Because in the beginning, there were only 3 symptoms that we knew about, like the cough, the fever, and shortness of breath. And as we move forward, and COVID being a pandemic, it was not just like clinicaltrials.gov, but all other registries, because trials were being conducted everywhere. And the list of symptoms kept increasing as we move further and further. So yes, like this was totally new thing. It was also impacting different parts of the body. So it was a new learning for all of us from that perspective.
Well, I would kind of agree with the point, fully agree with the point about data collection as well. So that we just came unprepared to do proper data collection at the pandemic. At least from what we are observing is that people had the technology there, but they did not have the proper data sources. They did not have the proper data tools to prepare the data, to collect it from the different sources, to also, like one of the issues we're talking about is data privacy here. So how do you make sure that you could actually gather data from all these scattered resources? So from that point of view, we were not prepared. And that's probably a major reason that affected also.
But I see that going forward, we are better prepared now. And I see the expectation for if we can deliver a COVID drug in less than a year, boy, I think we could do everything else much faster as well. And so I think we see a greater reliance on AI. But I did want to point out one win. Bit of a benevolent AI, a pharma company in the UK, identified this baricitinib from Eli Lilly as a candidate. And they did this using their knowledge graph. I only learned about this last week. And they gave it away for free. They informed them and said, yeah, this is a good treatment for it. And they used the knowledge graph to be able to do that. So I think this is actually a great win for AI. And I'm hoping to see a lot more of these kinds of things in the future as we ramp up our technology, the digital collection, as Philippe was saying, and gear towards it. And do you agree with me, I guess? Is that the trend you're seeing as well?
Yes,
Yes,
I mean, this.
for sure.
All right, very good. Maybe it's time to go on to our second question. All right, that is, how is AI used in clinical trials? Provide some examples, please. Very open question. Who would like to start this one?
I can take a first crack to it if you wish.
Please jump in.
So on our side, we are implementing artificial intelligence to actually develop disease models. We work on systemic lupus and on primary Sjogren. And what we do basically is we perform some molecular profiling of patients using multi-omics technologies, transcriptomics, proteomics, epigenetics, and so on and so forth. And basically, we try to, I would say, to characterize extensively those patients to try to stratify the patients into fairly homogeneous subgroups. And the idea for us is to try to then implement some kind of precision medicine by addressing or future treatments to the needs of those patients or patient subpopulations being precisely defined in molecular terms. And in order to do that, AI is absolutely necessary because we are processing literally millions of data points. So this is really, on one hand, massive, but also multimodal data, very different type of data. And as you know, what artificial intelligence brings, it allows to capture the value of not only structured data, but also unstructured data. That is that data which is not pre-formatted to be used into databases. So this is extremely useful to, I would say, capture the value of those data in the form of predictive models and thus of knowledge. And in relationship to clinical development, this disease modeling is very useful for us to, again, understand disease heterogeneity and thereby to implement not only precision medicine, but also to design clinical studies because we have now better or more information to select the proper patients we want to include in our clinical studies, and even we can make inferences of potential biomarkers or candidate biomarkers to I would say follow up those patients as we treat them in the context of clinical studies.
That's great. Dimitar, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I fully agree with Philippe here. We are seeing that with some of our customers in healthcare, namely big pharma companies. So essentially, the issue of what people nowadays call virtual trials, so matching patients with trials description in a more automated and efficient way. And that's been kind of one of the big topics of discussions as well. So all the points about that Philippe mentioned about transcriptomics, proteomics, etc. So that's obviously highly relevant. One thing I would like to add here, based on some of our use cases with customers, is that we are also seeing a significant increase in the use of survival analytics, so AI in survival analytics. And especially as a privacy company, so we're always talking about survival in the analytics in the context of multiple hospitals or multiple healthcare institutions that cannot otherwise share this data. So that's one of the trends that we are seeing in this space. And definitely virtual trials have been advancing quite a lot.
All right, a couple of questions for you about that. There's different definitions of virtual trials, I think. Could you be a bit more precise on exactly what you mean by that?
So I can explain my definition, which is probably the way I understand it as a non-expert in this area, and let the experts correct me. But essentially here, prior to that, when you want to select patients, you go to hospitals and essentially you ask for patients that are satisfying certain criteria. So here we are doing this in a much more automatic way, in the sense that on one side we have data that describes the trial. On the other side, you have data that describes the patient record. So that can be some clinical record, that can be some electronic health record. And just by doing an analytics on the two, automatic analytics, you can understand what patients are matching what trial description. You basically automate this process. Is that the understanding of everybody else here? You know,
if I may actually, Peter, react to what Dimitar is saying. When we speak about virtual patients, it's fair to say that as of today, we speak most particularly of virtual patients receiving a placebo. By this, we mean that we are going to model or to predict basically the evolution of a given disease in the context of a clinical trial if the patient receives a placebo or a standard of care, basically. And as Dimitar has mentioned, this is being accomplished by either using real-world data or actually also data from, I would say, historic placebo groups, you know, with the same disease, and that's the way this is being modeled. And I think this is a very, as Dimitar said, a very interesting area. As we probably will discuss later, what is very important for us as pharmaceutical companies is to understand the regulatory acceptance of those practices. And as of today, you know, I think we need to engage into some exchanges with regulatory agencies to understand, you know, how prepared they are to accept data thus generated with those virtual placebo patients.
All right, so I have a different definition again. So Philippe, what you described to me is a synthetic control arm or a digital twin. And that's different from a virtual trial, in my opinion, but Archna, could you clarify what you think is a virtual trial?
Right, like I'm more from the technology perspective, so I will depend on experts from pharma. But virtual was, in my mind, more related to like what Philippe had mentioned, placebo trials and so on. So that's how I took it. But again, like to follow up with Dimitar and Philippe, like how AI can help with clinical studies is especially both of them listed about the patient recruitment. And this data is totally unstructured in clinical trials, the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And that's where AI can really help extracting the right information. And then we can use that as a screening tool to go against the real world evidence like electronic health records to find the population. So that is one use case. And then the second use case, as Philippe mentioned, like once we have identified this information, extracted the key data, we could use this on a set of clinical trials to learn for similarity differences and also historic analysis to do our cohort design. So that's how like AI can really help in this area.
Right. So I think we've hit very hard the idea of the virtual trials. So my definition of virtual trials is actually different again. So I'm thinking about using different electronics to monitor patients and so on. And so that's a different kind of engagement with the patients, which has taken on some more importance with the COVID, of course. And there's a whole other field of that. Wearable sensors is, again, complementary to that in part of that, which is a huge market. It's supposed to explode in the next couple of years with the Fitbits, the cell phones and whatnot. But as it gets more sophisticated sensors, the ability to leverage AI to understand the signals that are coming back and use those to monitor patients allows you to get a whole lot more data than we would from a typical visit. And the typical example of that is the Parkinson's type of approach, where you have the UPDRS, the Universal Parkinson's Disease Scoring System, and you go into the clinic off your medicine, you wait, you do about an hour of tests with a clinician, you then take your medicine, wait for it to kick in, repeat the whole experiment, and you get one number from all that. And that's 3 hours of an active person's day, whereas you can get, I don't know, 40 measurements per second using a Fitbit sensor, tons of data, and you can understand when they're on their medicine, off their medicine, how long it takes, and so many other additional parameters that you could leverage. So I think there's a whole field of that, which is, of course, specific to certain diseases. It's not as good for monitoring cancer, but it is good for some muscular types of diseases. Outside of recruitment and the virtual trials, are there any other areas that you're involved in that where you think AI can help in the clinical trial space?
So the survival analytics, actually all the modeling behind survival analytics is one thing that we've seen definitely interest from big pharma companies. So here that could mean like Kaplan-Meier curves, computing Cox linear regression, Cox regression models, and so on. So this is exactly where we are seeing, so basically training and testing these models across different hospitals has been a challenge. And this is where we, Inpher as a company, are seeing a lot of traction.
Yeah, I think it's a great area because I think that machine learning has kind of abandoned the overall survival analysis. It's been left behind. It's only been the last couple of years that we've seen support vector machine, random forest, and even deep learning enter that space, which makes it a lot of opportunity there, I think.
And that speeds up kind of the trials. Yeah, sorry, Philippe.
No, go
ahead. I was going to just say that this will make the entire trial process a lot more efficient, obviously.
I just wanted to try to reply to your question, Peter. What could be the other application of AI to clinical studies on top of what we've already listed? As you said, we will have now more and more data, including data which will be generated and captured by patients using sensors and other connected devices. But then what AI can do, of course, is make sense of all those data. So this is the part about data analytics and really transforming this mass of, I would say, again, multimodal, very different, very variable data in the form of predictive models informing decision making. I think in the future, what the physicians listening to us could hope is to have the possibility to inform, to educate their decisions as physicians on the basis of a broad variety of data, including, in fact, some of the measurements being generated by the patients themselves, which mean obviously a better patient engagement in the clinical studies.
I'm going to get back to that question in a minute because I think the entry of AI into the clinic and have physicians use it is an interesting challenge. But I'll just throw out a couple other areas and see if they resonate with you. Patient engagement and making sure that patients don't drop out of a trial seems to be a challenge for us. And we're looking at that, as well as a lot of some very practical operations aspects of managing all the data, even QCing the different data sets we produce before we do a filing. It's an AI opportunity because there's so much data and it's such a manually intensive area. Looking at deviations and understanding the deviations, it's a ton of paperwork coming in, and I think AI has some opportunities there as well. And even just reconciling all the data to make sure it's consistent and reported right, looks like some great opportunities for AI. Has anyone experienced that? Looks like you
Yes.
have.
Actually,
Yep.
we are working with our clients in the same area because there is so much data, regulatory aspects, and so on. Also, adverse events, voice of consumers. So those are important areas for AI to help.
Great. Maybe we should go to our third question today. I see you coming in. All right. So what are the challenges to applying AI to the clinical trial space? Philippe, you've already kind of got us started on this with suggesting that we can use AI for better decision making, but I think that has a challenging area in itself. What do you think about that?
I fully agree, and because we're on a steep learning curve, so obviously, I think collectively what we're trying to describe here is the potential applications of AI to clinical studies and try to share our enthusiasm. But of course, there are many hurdles. And in my opinion, the first challenge is really accessing to the data. And I would say accessing to quality data. And that's a very important part. The second one is making sense from those data. And again, this is where, AI can be helpful. On the other hand, there's here again a steep learning curve because developing algorithms through machine learning is a journey, and I think here there is a challenge, but there is no doubt in my mind, from what I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, that progress is being made on a daily basis at an incredible speed, and that we will succeed in doing that. But it's still a difficult endeavor. And the last I would say hurdle or challenge, in my opinion, is again regulatory acceptance, because the technology goes fast, innovation goes fast, but at the end of the day, as a company, you have to put a file on the table of a regulatory agency, and the agency has to be comfortable with all the type of data and the way you generated the data. And I think this is where, again, and it's going to be actually very exciting, this is where we need to engage into in fact, a very close discussion and exchange actually with people from regulatory agencies.
Great. Lots of good points there. Anyone else like to add to that?
Yes, I see 2 challenges. I agree with Philippe completely. One is AI is also perceived as a black box, like you put data in, system generates something, but you do not know how and why. So as an AI company, like for us, transparency and explainability is important. So what we try to do is with every decision, also expose the evidence so that user has confidence in the system, that why system made certain decision. So that is one big challenge, is to not just produce results, but also produce with evidence. And second, as Philippe said, like understanding of data is very critical, because before we can apply AI technology, we need to understand data. And if we just look at the COVID-19 example, as we discussed earlier, like when we are bringing trials from all different registries, want to make sure that there is data standardization and data mapping, data normalization, because each registry has different terminology. Clinicaltrials.gov calls it phase for clinical development, like phase 1, 2, 3, and European Trial Registry calls it human pharmacology, or even like we will use different terminology for same thing, fever versus temperature, and so on. So knowledge about those type of data and terminology is also important to feed along with AI technology in order to make the right decisions.
So I definitely agree with both points here. So the point about explainability and the point about data uniformization. So that has been a big challenge. just from a pure machine learning perspective. I can also tell you one challenge from a purely privacy perspective, us as a privacy company. So there has been a big dichotomy between consent management and clinical trials, or deep technology in clinical trials. So deep privacy preserving technology. It looks like different jurisdictions are more open to consent management, where just the patient goes and gives its consent to have the data used for clinical trials, may potentially used in the clear, not even in ciphertext, versus other jurisdictions that would favor more technologies that are privacy preserving, in the sense that you give your consent that your data is used for a trial, but you ensure that the technology that uses this data is actually fully protecting the privacy of your medical data. So that's been a very interesting point. For example, if you look at the jurisdictions of US versus Canada, it's completely different. So Canada is much more open for consent management versus the US, who is the trend, at least now in the US, is that they're starting to talk much more about deep tech for those types of analytics. I don't know if the other panelists, Peter, would agree with that point, or if you have any observations.
Well, I think the Europe, the GDPR is kind of changed a lot of things in terms of everything. It's not only the management of the data, it's the software that controls it, the databases, and the ability to delete records, and that would change the results of analyses is a challenge for everything at all levels. But yes, I do agree. Dimitar, do you look at federated learning models? Is that the answer to these kinds of things?
Yes, so this is obviously the scalable. So we as a company work with a technology that secures federated learning. So federated learning itself is basically a distributed machine learning where you could build your models in a slightly different way than if your data was collected all in the same place, where you essentially build local models of multiple data sources. And then you aggregate these local models at a central location. The problem is that if you just aggregate these models in the clear, then that more or less mathematically reveals all of the information about the input data. So you want to make sure that this aggregation is done in a mathematically secure way. This is what Inpher is providing. So we're collaborating with big tech companies here in order to make sure that aggregation is done in a very secure fashion. So federated learning finds some enormous applications, apart from clinical trials, obviously in drug discovery. We're seeing big pharmaceutical companies that are collaborating among themselves for example, running very complex machine learning model for essentially molecular, searching certain molecular compounds in the entire cheminformatics space. So this is obviously one extremely interesting area. As I mentioned before, we had this example of the new discovery of antibiotics that would not have been possible without this sophisticated AI. So Inpher, we are really focused to provide the tools for this secure federated learning approach.
Interesting. Kind of going back to something that Archna set up about the ability to not have black box models, but have explainability. And I remember a use case from Rich Caruano at Microsoft who talked about pneumonia risk and hospitalization. And he went through this big exercise of lots of data, lots of patients, health records. And the question was, should you readmit a patient to the hospital? And they went through the full analyses, used the neural networks and all the appropriate models, and turned out that the neural network was the best model. It got the highest accuracy, not surprising, it's often the case. But then they looked at the data and they realized that he was making opposite predictions to what they thought. Patients with asthma and who were getting pneumonia, you would think they'd be at a higher risk, but it actually predicted the opposite. People with heart conditions predicted the opposite. And these weird artifacts started showing up in the data. And what it turned out is that they realized that some of the patients, if they have asthma, their doctor's going to meet them at the hospital. They know exactly what treatment, they know where they are in their progression. Same thing for heart patients. They already know what's going to happen. They're going to get them taken care of right away. Whereas if I went to the hospital, they probably wouldn't know any of these things. I don't have those conditions and they'd be starting from scratch. And so it gave me the opposite result by looking at the data. So Archna, how does what kind of techniques do you use to verify these kinds of things? And how would that work with Dimitar's idea of federated learning, where a lot of the stuff is hidden from you?
Right. So Peter, like what we are doing is we are using hybrid AI. So we are using machine learning as well as natural language understanding. And then as we mentioned, like this domain data and domain knowledge is important. So we also make use of standard and curated nomenclatures. And with this combination, every time like we extract something from relationship perspective or entity perspective, we also provide the evidence of the source data, like exactly where we got that information along with that sentence and link to the actual article. And this is how we provide the explainability part of the equation for user to get some confidence in the system.
Makes sense. Maybe we should go to our next question, which is coming up now. What is something that you were thinking about for the next year specifically when it comes to your AI-related initiatives? Who would like to start with this one?
I can start.
Sure.
Okay, so as we have been talking about like the confidence in the system, and especially with search in published material, like how do you know if something got published is correct or not? How do you validate it? So what we are thinking of taking the AI tool to the hands of subject matter experts, because they are the best judges of the domain information. And idea is for them to work with these tools in easy to use fashion so that they can validate quickly and system can learn from it. So there is a continuous learning loop. And the second thing we have realized with working with our clients, that when we are working on different use cases, like whether it is knowledge discovery, drug discovery versus the voice of consumer, where we are also looking at the patient-centric data from electronic health records, we need, like each of these have different lexicons, different terminologies. So we need to create different models, different AI models, depending upon the use case, and then make it, bring it together from the linking perspective. And as like all companies, pharma companies are working with different areas. So we are working with some of our clients in messenger RNA technology, as well as gene therapy to bring up some new treatments. So that's where we are helping our clients with AI technology.
It's going to be exciting here, I can tell.
Yeah.
Dimitar, what do you think?
So the specific steps that we're obviously doing. So one of the so I mentioned the point about consent management versus deep privacy tech for us. So that's obviously been a challenge for any company that's doing in deep privacy tech. However, what we identified and what we are planning for next year at least is we identified that consent management and deep privacy tech could actually be complementary. So there could be cases where consent management can be used, and there could be cases where deep privacy tech can be used. For that, we have undertaken collaboration with companies that actually work on consent management. We're having a consortium already with another company in Switzerland and another in Eastern Europe, where we are developing a joint solution for that, specifically targeted to pharma companies. On the digital diagnostics and clinical trials and survival analytics, we are essentially putting our models in the context of federated learning, as I mentioned. So that's an objective, making sure that these are deployed and tested. And so that's a very good specific goal. And as a last step, we are going to try to engage probably in use cases that are actually facilitating also the drug discovery process, again with big pharma.
Sounds like you have a busy year coming up.
You have a busy year, exactly. Yeah.
Philippe, what's your next year plans?
Well, I guess it will be quite busy as well, because what is really the most exciting application for me of AI is really to try to predict in silico with a computer the efficacy of our drug candidates. And we're trying to do that in the context of systemic lupus. And the idea basically is that again, back to this profiling, molecular profiling of thousands of patients, we came to some representation of lupus, either in the blood or in target organs, for example, in the skin or kidney, in the form of an interactome of genes or proteins, which we believe are very important in the causality of the disease. There are specific computer analysis. This is being called network computing, which allows to make some predictions there. And I'm really fascinated by that because, of course, if you combine this with a precise knowledge of the affinity of your drug or your antibody, for example, and its biodistribution, pharmacokinetics, you can basically put all of this into equations, mathematical equations, and try to predict how your drug will perturb the disease, which in fact is a biological system. And of course, we're trying to model also what is going on in healthy tissues or in the blood of healthy patients with respect to their immune responses. And the idea for us then is to bring back a diseased biological system, you might say, back to a homeostatic level or I would say functionality. And we're not there at all. Huh? That's as of today, we're not there. But I think this is really, for me, that would be the grail. And of course, it would not, if we're successful in predicting to some level the efficacy of our drugs in silico, it would not replace, as you can imagine, real-world clinical studies, but it would educate those, I would say, real-world studies needed to validate the computer prediction. And of course, it will also reduce the burden and the cost and the duration of the clinical development. So I think this is, for me, the next fascinating frontier for AI. In fact, there are many fascinating frontiers for AI in drug development, but this one is a very exciting one.
So it sounds like systems biology meets AI, which would be an interesting fusion.
Exactly.
It's nice to see the systems biology come back. It's kind of receded for a few years, and the opportunities, I think, are still ahead of us. From my perspective, I think that NLP, as Archna said, is really one of the hot areas. It's gone with such a massive transformation with the new technologies in the last couple of years that I don't think their applications have yet caught up to all the things we can do with the new capabilities that the transformer models, BERT, and so on have provided. And so I think that there's plenty of room for use of it in the research side, as well as all the way through the analysis of forms, even pharmacovigilance, and kind of everything in between for the clinical trial documentation, management, understanding the health records, matching patients, and everything else. So I think it's going to be an exciting, probably a couple of years in that journey of leveraging the advanced NLP, which is still moving at a furious pace. But the last couple of years have just been breathtaking speed. All right, I think our last question is, yes, there's a lot of focus on AI ethics, compliance, and data privacy. What are the best practices that companies can adopt today to address these concerns? I think Dimitar, you're probably the best person to ask this question of, so let's start with you.
They can use Inpher's product for sure. I think it's very clear that this area needs more education on privacy-preserving technologies that could definitely address this GDPR compliance issues. So I feel that this technology is still new. The market is still very fragmented in the healthcare space, but any initiative that could be targeted towards educating the market of how these tools can essentially complement the current machine learning tools used for all the applications that, for example, Peter just mentioned. I think that would be a very good step for the community to sort of understand, play with these technologies. We as a company have provided a special tried version where we do have some very explicit use cases related to digital diagnostics and also clinical trials where people could just experiment and learn how these tools could function in a federated setting. So.
Thank you. We're down to our last few minutes. We're going to ask for like 1 minute answer. Archna, what do you think is the best answer to this question about how ethics, AI, and compliance and privacy fit in?
Right. From technology side, like we are working with our clients from the PII perspective, patient identified information from clinical data and electronic health records. So those are the ways we are dealing with patient identifiable information, so that can be excluded as we are sharing the data.
Philippe.
Well, on our side, I mean, being a European-based company, of course, we have the GDPR, and which is very clear, very demanding, and in the essence, you know, we have to be very compliant to this period. In fact, what I would say on this question is, I think what is at stake is also being still able, while obviously respecting those regulations, to basically capture the value of all this information to help the patients in the long term. And thus it's really respecting obviously the confidentiality of those health data together with promoting innovation. And I think this is a real challenge. And I think we need to think further on how, you know, obviously through data anonymization is really one very important piece. We can still capture the value of the data from patients without, I would say, infringing their privacy or creating any ethical problem. I think that's a very important issue.
Also,
Go ahead.
so just the concept of explainability here is very important for that. So when you give your data out there for analysis, just knowing what's happening with this data, I think that's going to have a big impact on the ethical issues as well.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. I think that the notion of bias in the results is going to be the one that hits the fan this year. We're seeing more and more of it, and the FDA is now requiring a balance of different ethnicities, nationalities, and race be included in different studies. And we're balancing that against the different disease populations, but how do you focus and make sure that the results are not only explainable, but also unbiased? And I think that's a challenge ahead of us that will govern its acceptance. All right, just a quick question for everyone. If you had $100 to discover the new drug, what fraction would you spend on AI? Archna, first up for you.
Being an AI company, we would spend majority of money for AI.
All right, almost all of it. Dimitar, what do you think?
Well, AI cannot replace the entire process of drug discovery, but it can, in fact, enable it. So I would say I would spend maybe a third of that. I wouldn't spend 70% of that $100, but I would spend a significant amount of money on AI.
Very good. Philippe, what do you think?
I would say 50-50 because what is really going to win is the synergy. It's not AI replacing by no means you know, the human intelligence. There is this part about the convergence and the synergy, in fact, of human and machine intelligences. And I'm fascinating every day about what is changing in our daily professional life. That is this necessity now to interact with people, literally living on different planets. I mean, as an immunologist, I, you know, interact now with computational scientists or people doing data management, and you know, it's very interesting. And at the end of the day, success will be in our capacity to work together. And it's a great human experience. So I would put a coin on both sides. You know, the biological medical side, and one on the computational data side. 50-50.
I agree. I think we need a balance, but I think that's about all the time we have for us. So it's been very nice chatting with you and engaging about this, and it looks like exciting years ahead. Thank you.
Awesome. Wow, this has been an awesome panel. So thank you all to all of our panelists, and a special thank you to Peter for moderating. We really appreciate your insights, and I know the audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and I'll see you around.